You're listening to the Hayek Program podcast. This podcast includes audio from lectures, interviews, and discussions from scholars and visitors of the F.A. Hayek Program for Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. To learn more about the Hayek Program, visit hayek.mercatus.org. To learn about graduate student fellowship opportunities with the Mercatus Center at George Mason University for students at Mason as well as at universities across the globe, please visit students.mercatus.org.
Welcome, everyone, to the Hayek Program podcast. My name is Chris Coyne, and I am the Associate Director of the F.A. Hayek Program for Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics at the Mercatus Center, and a Professor of Economics at George Mason University. Today, I am joined with a wonderful panel of superstar scholars in political economy and public choice, and we are here to discuss Randy Holcomb's new book, Following Their Leaders, Political Preferences and Public Policy, which was recently published by Cambridge University Press. And before we begin our discussion, let me briefly introduce each of our speakers. And I can't do justice to their accomplishments and scholarship, so I highly recommend that those who are interested check out their respective websites, which has their entire body of research. So our main speaker today, the author of the book, is Randy Holcomb, and Randy is DeVoe Moore Professor of Economics at Florida State University. He is a prolific scholar in the areas of public choice, constitutional political economy, public finance, and Austrian economics. And we will be discussing his most recent book in a series of books that he's written on public choice and the political process. Our next guest is Roger Congleton. Roger is BB&T Professor of Economics at West Virginia University. He is the co-editor of the journal Constitutional Political Economy, and his most recent book is Solving Social Dilemmas, Ethics, Politics, and Prosperity, which was published by Oxford University Press. Bobbi Herzberg is a distinguished senior fellow at the F.A. Hayek Program for Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics, and a senior research fellow with the program. She is a scholar who works at the intersection of political science, political economy, and economics, and she has contributed scholarship to a wide variety of areas, including in the Bloomington tradition, where she had in the past worked closely with the Ostroms in addition to her other work. And then finally, we have Mike Munger. Mike is a professor in the Department of Political Science and the Department of Economics at Duke University. He is also the director of the Philosophy, Politics, and Economics program at Duke. And his most recent book is The Sharing Economy, Its Pitfalls and Promises. But that book builds on his prior book, which I wanted to mention, Tomorrow 3.0, Transaction Costs and the Sharing Economy, which was published by Cambridge University Press. And I mentioned that we had a all-star lineup, and I wasn't exaggerating. I should also mention that all of our panelists today are past presidents of the Public Choice Society. And so for people who are interested in public choice scholarship, I could not ask for a better group of scholars and thinkers to talk about these issues and to discuss the open areas in public choice. So with that, let me turn it over to Randy. And Randy, let me just ask you to discuss some of the core themes and points and issues that you want to raise with the book. And then we'll go around and have our panelists discuss and follow up with the points you raised. So Randy, please.
Thank you very much, Chris. I appreciate the introduction, and thank you to the panelists. I appreciate your being here to discuss these ideas also. We assume that citizens and voters have public policy preferences. And what I'm looking at here is how do they form their public policy preferences? So a lot of public policies, some of them more complex, some more opaque than others. People have preferences on abortion, gun control, tax policy, foreign policy. There tend to be persuasive arguments on all sides. Opinion tends to be divided. So how do citizens and voters form their public policy preferences? And what I'm arguing here is they anchor on a political party, on a politician, on an ideology. They accept that anchor, and then they derive most of their public policy preferences from those of their anchors. Basically, the political elite tell them what to think, and they follow their leaders. Citizens and voters just don't have policy preferences. They get them from somewhere. And I'm saying they get them from the political elite. And there are implications at a couple of different levels on this. First of all, we sometimes have this romantic notion of democracy where democratic governments are accountable to citizens and voters, and democratic governments act in the interest of citizens and voters. But if citizens and voters are getting their policy preferences from the political elite, that really calls into question this romantic notion of democracy. It calls into question the degree to which democratic governments really are accountable to their citizens. So that's, at the conclusion, that's one level I want to think about in applying these ideas. Another level is more at the academic level. So the panelists will be well aware in public choice, social sciences, when we look at models of democratic decision-making, we tend to assume voters have preferences and that parties and candidates adjust their policy platforms to conform with voter preferences. So I'm arguing really the direction of causation mostly goes the other way, that candidates and parties develop their platforms and then they sell them to voters. Voters and citizens adopt the policy views of the political elite. Like I say, they follow their leaders. Now, one of the foundational ideas here that I try to put across, I base these arguments to begin with on the difference between instrumental and expressive choices. This is an idea that's fairly well known already in public choice, but instrumental choices are choices where you make a choice and it affects the outcome you get. Expressive choices, you make a choice and it has no effect on the outcome. So, for example, you go into a restaurant, you look at the menu, you choose the salad rather than the pizza. You get the salad. That's an instrumental choice. On the other hand, you go into the voting booth, you vote for candidate A over candidate B. The same person is elected no matter who you choose. So that's an expressive choice. You make a choice, but it has no impact on the outcome. I mean, think about it. In the last presidential election, 2020, if you had voted for President Biden, who would be president today? Biden. If you'd voted for Donald Trump, who would be president today? Biden. And if you didn't vote at all, who would be president today? Biden. Okay, so that's an expressive choice. You go into the voting booth, you make a choice, but it doesn't have any impact on the outcome. So one result of that is that people's expressive choices are not necessarily going to be the choices they would make if the choice were theirs alone. The choices they express for these expressive choices can be different from their instrumental choices. Let me give you a couple of examples to think about. One of them, the panelists will be familiar with Gordon Tullock's article, Charity of the Uncharitable. Basically, he's talking about expressive choices. He gives an example of an uncharitable person. He's not giving money to charity because any money you give to charity, less that you have for yourself. But he feels a little bit bad about that. I ought to be charitable, but I just want to keep my money for myself. Okay, but then he goes into the voting booth and he has the option of voting for a candidate who advocates redistribution to the poor. And so he casts that vote. He feels like it's a charitable vote. Hey, I'm voting for redistribution. He gets a good feeling about casting that charitable vote, but it costs him nothing because the outcome of the election is going to be the same regardless of who he votes for. So people can make expressive choices that are different from the choices they would make if the choice were theirs alone. Another interesting example I'll bring up, it's a little bit dated, but I think it's a really interesting example of what I would argue is an expressive choice. Back in 1998, so it's a little bit dated, in 1998, Jesse Ventura was elected governor of Minnesota. Very interesting because he ran as a third-party candidate. Now, for people who don't know, Jesse Ventura was a professional wrestler. He had a lot of name recognition because of his profession. And the Republicans put up a guy named Norm Coleman. The Democrats put up Hubert Humphrey III as their candidate. Neither the Democrats or Republicans are really overly fond of the candidates the parties had on the ballot. So you imagine a voter going into the voting booth there, Republicans looking at the ballot thinking, I'm not really crazy about Norm Coleman, but I'm sure not going to vote for the Democrat. There's Jesse Ventura. I'll cast my protest vote for Jesse Ventura. And the Democrats the same way. I'm not all that fond of Hubert Humphrey, but I'm sure not going to vote for the Republican. There's Jesse Ventura. I'll cast my protest vote for Jesse Ventura. And here's my conjecture on that if after people are leaving the polling place, like you grab a Jesse Ventura voter and you say, normally we select the governor based on who gets the most votes. But in this case, we're doing the election differently. Instead of counting up all the votes, we're picking one voter at random who gets to choose the governor. And we've chosen you. And my conjecture is almost every Jesse Ventura voter that you would pick would not pick Jesse Ventura if the choice were that voter's choice alone. With expressive voting, people will vote for alternatives that make them feel good, not necessarily for the alternatives they would choose if the choice were theirs alone. Now, a well-established idea in public choice is this notion of voters being rationally ignorant. You're rationally ignorant because your choice isn't going to determine the outcome of an election. Okay. Now, expressive voting rests on that same foundation as rational ignorance. If people are rationally ignorant because they know their vote won't affect an election outcome, they also know their vote is purely expressive. So as a result, it ought to be easier to influence people's political views than the choices that they make that are instrumental choices. But there's a whole advertising industry that's designed to affect mostly people's instrumental choices. I mean, think about it. If people can be influenced to change their views about what laundry detergent they should use or what automobile that they should drive, surely they would be more easily influenced to change their political preferences, which are purely expressive, which have no instrumental impact. So this idea of expressive voting is pretty well established in the public choice literature, and what I try to contribute in this book is that literature on expressive voting has made the case that people vote expressively, but hasn't really looked in detail at how are those expressive preferences determined. So I look at some factors to try to figure out, okay, people vote expressively. How are those expressive preferences determined? And there are a lot of factors, and I go through and analyze a lot in the social sciences literature, thinking about factors. I mean, one is people like to have a feeling of belonging. People tend to hold political preferences that are similar to their family's preferences. If you grew up in a Republican household, you're more likely to be Republican. The friends, the people they associate with, you tend to adopt the political preferences of those people. There may be an element of peer pressure in there too. I mean, if you're in with a group of people, you're sort of talking about political issues and so forth. I mean, you can argue with your peers. That might be uncomfortable, and it also might make you feel like you're not as much a member of the group. Or you can be persuaded by them. Join with your friends. And again, there's no instrumental cost of doing so. You can change your political preferences and the outcome is going to be the same. I talk a little bit about the endowment effect. The endowment effect, you just value things more because you consider that they're your own. And I think as much as goods, it also applies to people's opinions. These are my political views. I value them because they're mine. I'm going to be resistant to change. As far as adopting all of those derivative preferences, all of the preferences of the person you're anchoring on or the party you're anchoring on, it reduces cognitive dissonance. I mean, you show up at the voting booth and you're thinking, I really like this candidate's views on this issue and that issue, but not so much on these other issues. I'm going to vote for the candidate. You might not feel all that good doing that. You agree with some things, you disagree with others. But if you buy the whole platform, hook, line, and sinker, you cast your vote, you feel good about it, it reduces cognitive dissonance. There also might be an element of the bandwagon effect here. People like to vote for winners. And so as a result, in political campaigns, every candidate claims to be ahead in the polls. I mean, it's kind of interesting. You see an election, one candidate running against another. Both of them are saying they're ahead in the polls. Well, people like to vote for a winner, so you want to try to convince, hey, cast your vote for me. I'm a winner. And then there's political advertising and mass media. And because people's expressive preferences, you're voting for something that makes you feel good, not necessarily what you would choose if the choice were theirs alone. It's a feel-good thing. And political advertising works that same way. If you look at political ads, very short on any solid content, it's all feel-good stuff. I mean, political ads essentially say, not quite this bluntly, but political ads say, vote for me and you'll feel good. Right. And any negative advertising the same way. People claim to hate negative ads. Looks like they're effective and candidates run them. And what's the message in a negative ad? If you vote for my opponent, you're going to feel bad. Right. So political advertising, I discussed some other factors, but I'll skip over some of that. The way that people form their policy preferences, they anchor on a politician, a party, or an ideology, and then all of their policy views are derivative of their anchor. They derive their policy preferences from those of the political elite from their anchor. They follow their leaders. Anchor preferences define people's political identities. They define how people see themselves, how they want others to see them, and then they derive most of their policy preferences from their anchors. So when you look at people's policy preferences on issue after issue after issue, sometimes, the way we might think about this is somebody saying, on the abortion issue, I'm pro-choice. I favor stricter gun control. I think the rich are not paying their fair share of taxes. That's what Democrats think. Therefore, I'm a Democrat. What I'm saying is the direction of causation goes the other way. You anchor on that you're a Democrat. Hey, I'm a Democrat. Therefore, I'm pro-choice on the abortion issue. I favor stricter gun control. I want more progressive taxes. That your policy preferences are derived from your anchors. I mean, it's kind of interesting that there's such a close correlation on political views across all of these issues. What's the connection, if we think about it, what's the connection between people's views on abortion and their views on the progressivity of the tax system? It seems like those issues really don't have that much to do with each other, right? But if you tell me what somebody's views are on the progressivity of the tax system, you think the rich are paying their fair share? You think we ought to have more progressive taxes? You tell me what somebody's views are, and I'll give you a pretty good prediction about what their views are on the abortion issue. And why? Well, it's because their preferences are derivative of their anchors. Policy preferences are expressive, so there's no instrumental cost in preferring bad policies. Policy issues a lot of times tend to be complex, so people defer to their anchors as experts. And when you adopt all those policy preferences of your anchors, it reduces cognitive dissonance. It's easier for you to cast your vote and feel good about casting that vote. Now, when I talk about this, I tell people, hey, I'm not talking about you. I'm talking about other people, right? Because you're thinking, no, that's not how I form my policy preferences. I'm rational. I think through the issues. Yeah, I know. Okay, so you do. But think about the Trump supporters. They're just buying his lines, hook, line, and sinker, and go at the other end. Think about the people who are Bernie Sanders supporters. Yes, I mean, they're just buying what he says. They're not really thinking critically. I mean, doesn't it seem like that's how people are adopting their policy preferences? So people have a choice of anchors. You could choose one anchor or another anchor. But once they do that, most of their policy preferences then are derivative of their anchors. They accept the policy preferences of the political elite. They follow their leaders. So if I think about implications on this for us academics here on the panel, first of all, I'll go to bat against some of these voting models, where we assume voters have preferences and then candidates and parties adjust their platforms to voter preferences. So I'm saying, no, that goes the other way. That candidates and parties adopt political platforms, and voters and citizens, they follow their leaders. They pick up the policy preferences that are sold to them by the political elite. And this is especially applicable to models of social choice. So if you look at social choice, I mean, the basic idea there is we look at the policy preference, we look at the preferences, the preference rankings that individuals have, and we try to figure out how can we aggregate those preferences so that the aggregate choice best represents the underlying preferences of the individuals who are making their individual choices. But if those preferences that we see are expressive choices, not instrumental choices, that really pulls the rug out of that whole area of social choice. So when we look at the way government operates, we look at collective decision-making, I think public choice models of rent-seeking, of regulatory capture, of interest group politics, they're much more descriptive of the political process than some of these voting models, the models of democratic choice that we tend to use. And those models, the rent-seeking models, regulatory capture, I mean, those are models where it's the political elite that's driving the political process and largely imposing costs on the masses. So there are implications there for academic models, for the way that we study and analyze the public sector and political decision-making. And stepping back to larger issues, there are implications for democratic governments. Democratic governments are less accountable to their citizens than this romantic notion of democracy would lead people to believe. Democratic oversight is not an effective constraint on the abuse of power by the public elite, because citizens and voters adopt the political preferences of the political elite. So let me wrap up my comments there, and I will be very interested to hear what the commentators have to say.
Thank you very much, Randy. I appreciate it. Roger Congleton, please.
First, let me start with the positive things, the things that I think are kind of very neat about the book. First, it's a really easy read. There are very few academic books that you could kind of grab at 8, 9 o'clock at night and read through the whole thing and keep you up until 1 a.m. and you're done. Okay. Usually the books will just put you to sleep right away. So in that sense, it's a very readable project. And it's also a very thought-provoking book, even if you disagree with it, which is also a value added of reading. That is, if you come away from a book with a bunch of questions and a kind of better grasp of where you actually are afterwards, regardless of whether that's because you disagree with everything in the book that's been said, or agree with some and not others, and so forth, or just buy it hook, line, and sinker, which is sort of consistent with Randy's hypothesis, by the way, but I suspect it's not going to be as true of the readers as he hopes. You still walk away with value added, and so the book does have some nice value added. Second, although I don't care a lot for the vocabulary used, the elites, masses, anchors, and so forth, I generally agree that preferences are, in a sense, endogenous at the margin, product of lifelong learning and experience, and that political parties and politicians can, to some degree, influence the policy preferences of voters, at least at the margin. More on that later. Third, the book includes many sub-themes, as well as the overarching one. And many of these are really nicely done. So the discussion of why voting is expressive is very nice and sharp. The discussion about divisiveness, which Randy didn't mention, of politics is also very nice. Being on the winning side of politics can be important as far as one's future income or longevity is concerned, although perhaps less true of liberal democracies and autocracies. There certainly are cases where that's the condition that most people face. Of course, the divisiveness of policies or policy decisions depend to some extent on the type of policy being discussed and whether policies are constrained by a generality rule or not. Many Western democracies are pretty well constrained by generality rules. And regarding expressive voting, I have had arguments with people who talk about expressive voting for about 30 years, I think. And so I think you can make a pretty clear case that voting is expressive if people are aware of some of the ideas from public choice. On the other hand, what they're going to express is kind of important. So if the reason you vote is you want to express your support for a policy that you generally think is a good policy, then your expressive vote looks just like an instrumental vote. And to assume that it's instrumental is not crazy. On the other hand, if you vote because of some kind of moral intuition about what a good policy or good society looks like, Maybe to use Randy's example, the pizza and salad, maybe you would have been better off with the salad, but chose the pizza because you thought, well, gee, that's going to really taste good tonight. But if I were in my true long run self, I would want to have the salad. Maybe when you get to the voting booth, you vote for the salad instead of the pizza. That could be a good thing. So there are a lot of scenarios where expressive voting actually improves the quality of politics rather than worsens it. And the case has not really been made that expressive voting necessarily worsens political outcomes. So now on to the bigger meat, the main theme of the paper, that we are all sheep, basically, as the picture on the cover indicates. I'm not sure whether Randy got to pick it or not, but it's really quite a nice summary of the book. Here, there's a lot to disagree with, and in fact, the book itself kind of disagrees with itself half the time. That is, the book talks about longer-term influences on anchors, such as the Enlightenment scholars that help to propel the modern world, or at least get it off in that direction. And of course, if they actually are influencing our anchors, and the anchors are not really very flexible, okay, they have a 300-year lag or something like that. He also talks about families and so forth, as he did in his talk, and to the extent that families influence the kind of political views that you develop or take to be true, then how you think when you're 25 will influence how you think when you're 55. Okay, and so at the margin, politicians 30 years later aren't going to have much of an effect on the way you think. So there's a sense in which those parts of the book suggest that contemporary politicians do not have very much influence over the way people actually think about policies on a day-to-day basis. If they have an effect, it's a cumulative effect that kind of builds up over decades and may persuade people to change their minds about one kind of policy or another policy. What politicians can influence, I think, at the margin more than preferences is expectations. To the extent that they have some expertise in an area or can pretend to have expertise in an area, they can kind of provide facts or kind of at least storylines that suggest that you should expect bad outcomes from policy X rather than the good ones you currently believe. And therefore, you might change your mind, even though your policy preferences per se did not change. Your expectations of consequences do change, and that might change the way you vote. I don't know how common that scenario is, but one would be an example might be the switch in the green movement as the global warming ideas got to be taken seriously in the early 90s, which kind of flipped over a huge range of green policy type preferences. As counterexamples to these, this idea that people are in a sense kind of puppets. You can think of Mayor Bloomberg's campaign for president a few years back, where he spent about $1 billion trying to persuade people to adopt his positions, and he didn't win a single primary as a consequence, even though he outspent the entire field by about a factor of 2. And last, I guess I'll say the book confuses to some extent the difference between preferences and delegation. To say I vote in favor of candidate X because I agree with him or her is different from saying I vote in favor of X because I trust him or her to make the quote unquote right decisions for me when he or she is behind closed doors and that is not being closely monitored. So if you come to that conclusion about a party or a person, you don't necessarily adopt all their policy positions. You just trust them in some sense to make policy decisions that on average are going to make you better off. And that kind of voting strategy is perfectly consistent with economizing information, but still voting more or less instrumentally. So I guess the bottom line for me is, although I disagree with the main theme and don't think he really did, Randy did manage to establish that as a kind of a true description of the way voters behave. As virtually puppets of the last speech they heard. I still think the book is well worth reading. It does try to develop a theory of voter ideas about politics. I don't find that theory convincing as a short-run theory, but as a long-run theory, it has some merit, I think. It's certainly well worth an evening or two to read and think about because it raises a lot of interesting questions, even if in the end you wind up disagreeing with Randy's answers. Thanks.
All right, Roger, thank you very much. Bobbi Herzberg, please.
Thanks. And thanks for this opportunity and for writing the book, Randy. I really appreciated having the opportunity to read it. and to think about it. And I, too, was very impressed at how sort of conversationally you put a lot of public choice, a lot of work on these kinds of issues together in one volume, touching on, I think, virtually every aspect that has come up over my time with public choice, which is quite a long time, as it turns out. And so that alone in 200 pages is, I think, an incredibly impressive feat. And I found myself nodding away at, yes, these are the things that would happen. Yes, these are the things that have shaped this. So I highly recommend, especially the new student to these areas, to pick this up and to go to some of the footnotes, to look at some of the debates that have taken place over time about what is it that drives voting when, in fact, your vote is not instrumental in terms of impacting the outcome. What is it that still drives people to the polls? And while it used to be back in the 40 years ago when people were debating this heavily to try and account for it in rational choice theory, the argument was, well, people, it's that feel good component, that it makes them feel good to go to vote, which seemed like a throwaway category, almost an error term, and not a very helpful explanation. So you give a lot more meat to that logic of expressive voting and what one actually gains by getting to support the team. And I liked the team analogy, that whole logic that you developed through that is we're going to support our team. But what I thought was interesting was I was thinking about it as a team is we also yell at the people a lot that don't seem to be doing what the team needs at any given point. So I'm thinking about all the times that my husband this year is a huge Cardinal fan. Mike will appreciate this. As a huge Cardinal fan, has been cursing the management of the Cardinals and the pitching. Yes, exactly. In any case, with the Cardinals, he is capable of distinguishing between being a lifelong Cardinal fan and the inadequacies of the person or the representative that is bringing those Cardinals to them and the disaster that they are this season. And so I think that's also the case in politics, that yes, we follow our leaders, but we also kick our leaders, and they often become something we push back significantly against. And so one of the things I kept asking myself as I was going through this is, when does this change? When do we change our expressive votes, change the way in which we interact expressively to alter the kinds of people who are the elite we're listening to? And, Roger has already noted that this lifelong sort of development of our preferences versus the more short-term kinds of things. And I was thinking about the most recent election that's coming up in terms of presidential elections in the United States, and thinking, first of all, being depressed about that, but quite apart from that component, the idea that no one, I think, wants these to be the leaders they want to follow, and yet they are following these leaders. So what does it say when expression is done with your nose held, not about policies, but about the actual leaders that are supposed to be the glue holding it together? In some ways, even strong Trump voters don't care for all of Trump. You see this with a lot of Christian voters and others that seem to be confounded on how can you support Donald Trump. And likewise, Biden, many Democrats recognizing this is not the sort of banner bearer they would like to be carrying their party's sort of platform. And so to some extent, one wants to ask, when is it that expression becomes more automated and not really expressive? So not satisfying that I voted for the Democrats or I voted for the Republicans. And I liked your Jesse Ventura and bringing that up, because that is one of those where, but I would disagree with you on what someone would do. I think if you told someone that they could, when they are peeved at their core leaders, they're more likely. Many Perot voters, for example, in the election with Bush, the whole idea of, well, can we switch these around? Are we going to get a very different kind of outcome if I vote for it? And maybe that middle of the road candidate doesn't get it because they don't think that they can be expressive enough to actually create the kind of separation that is necessary in this modern arena. So I like that sometimes looking at, well, what are the corner points, or when do we see change, as a way of trying to understand why we adhere to things in the first place. And then additionally, I need to bring in a little bit of Ostromian things. This is very presidential, national level in its analysis, in the sense that we really are such a huge part. The electorate is so huge that my only hope is to be expressive, because I simply cannot even come close to thinking I'm going to have any impact on what actually happens. But a lot of opportunities in politics and a lot of governing take place at much smaller levels, where in fact we can have a more impactful effect on the outcome. And so why don't we see people who might want to have that kind of impact flowing to those? And who do we see flowing to those arenas, as opposed to using this kind of expressive conduct to try and change things at the national level? Why do we see so much more voting at the national level than we see at local level, when that instrumental component is so much weaker in that context? And our choices, even during primaries, seem to be reduced. So that's another question, I think, that in teasing out this difference between expressive and instrumental, and the degree to which I perceive that becomes a real part of the argument that I think you could develop even further than you have in this relatively short treatment. Other things I wanted to raise that came up, of course, the issue of institutions, and you do pick that up, especially with regard to the founding and federalism and some of the institutional arrangements that were put into, check and balance, that this institutional logic also helps to explain. And of course, the two-party and nature of our electoral system emerges as a result of those institutional rules, and thus give us less potential for instrumental rather than expressive kinds of treatments. So a bit more on not just how those types of institutions that provide checks between elites, but also the degree to which that has diluted the notion of any kind of popular impact on the outcomes of elections, I think, again, would be real grist for the mill in terms of taking this idea further, and whether people are actually interested in participating in that. And one of the last things I was thinking about with regard to this is the degree to which we're seeing these sort of localized protests come out, whether it's BLM or parents at school board meetings, etc. We're starting to see expressive turn into instrumental. And again, I think that would be a really interesting area to try to tease out the degree to which this is completely controlled by elites versus new elites emerging sort of outside of the institutional structure and outside of the system. And what has allowed that to happen? And part of the argument undoubtedly is the nature of new communications and technology, and the idea that we can now sort of open things up and have broader based communication, make a lot of these more localized efforts to try and take on some of these issues in a way that we couldn't see as much with the public before, and thus much more elite dependence. What is the nature of the elites that operate in that arena as opposed to the more traditional sort of public choice elites that we see in terms of incumbency and electoral types of politics, and the type of more structured nature of our political parties, etc. And then just, is there no hope? I only got to I think it's on page 196 or something. It's like the last couple of pages of the book. You get this, well, maybe there's hope kind of statement. And I think that was a mistake. I think along the way, giving public choice is always known as being the sort of darker cousin you don't want to bring to Thanksgiving dinner. It could be more hopeful. And I think a little bit of input from folks like the Ostroms and others who operate in the arena of perhaps we could find our instrumental effects in other arenas, participating in homeowners associations, being the old biddy on the corner, doing a variety of things, maybe even the protest movements I was talking about, the parents at the PTA meetings or school board meetings. These are ways in which perhaps we've substituted what may at one point have been the more Tocquevillian participation in politics. Now perhaps we've moved to that being just an expressive arena, and our real interaction in terms of self-governing, in terms of getting things done, may have shifted more to civil society or other arenas where we're satisfying that itch and maybe not seeing politics as the answer to it. And so with that, I think I've said enough, so I'll leave it there. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Bobbi. Mike Munger, please.
Well, I had not expected to be the most positive of the three commentators, but here we are. I thought this was terrific. There are, in the history of social choice, I come from a different tradition of public choice. I am not from the Virginia school. I'm much more from the Rochester Caltech school. There's a distinction in that kind of social choice between two kinds of elections, committee elections and mass elections. And much of the work in spatial theory was on committee elections, that is, relatively small groups, 100% turnout, and everyone is well informed about the consequences of their choices. Mass elections comes through Anthony Downs, and then it was elaborated through a series of papers. Peter Ordashuk famously in 1969 said, it seems that there are two separate spaces. One is the n-dimensional policy space where we think of politics as cashing out, and the other is what Ordashuk called the basic space, the space of values in which people actually reason and argue. It's rare to, sometimes they'll argue about specific line items, but most of the time they argue about basic values. And Downs took a particular perspective. What Downs said was that voters, and he's an economist, so that makes sense, we start with fixed exogenous preferences in the n-dimensional policy space. And then ideologies are a means of economizing on the cost of gathering information. So it's a shortcut, it's a heuristic, but it doesn't actually mean anything. We don't have much emotional attachment to these ideologies. What we actually care about is the n-dimensional policy space. Now, that's fine, that's an argument. And it's perhaps not surprising that economists would think in those terms, because we would like for preferences to be fixed and exogenous because of the Becker rule, not because we think preferences always are fixed, but because of the discipline it imposes. If the first thing that you get to do anytime you see a change is to say, well, preferences must have changed, that's too easy. You should stick with changes of the parameters of the model before you look at changes in the underlying assumptions. But that's not a fixed rule. It might just be that sometimes there are preference changes. And if there are, where do they come from? So I am blessed to follow both Roger and Bobbi, because I do think that if you wanted to talk about long-term people's basic identity, maybe those are relatively fixed. But if you're trying to explain changes, if you're trying to explain the election and the follow-up to Donald Trump, then I think there's a great deal here that is quite useful. So in elaborating the Downsian model, first Hinnick and Pollard, and then I, in a book with Mel Hinnick that was published in 1994, said that we will look at the way that the ideological space is imposed on the n-dimensional policy space, and that will constrain voters because the two parties create a line in an n-dimensional space, and that's the set of alternatives that are available to me. So there's a political constraint that I can only choose what the parties offer. But my preference is still live in the n-dimensional policy space. Now, that book has more than 1,000 citations. It is one of the most cited things that I've ever written. I actually think it's a really cool model, and in mathematical terms, it's great. I have decided in the last 5 years or so it's wrong, and after reading Randy's book, I think that his explanation is correct. We need to reverse the direction of causation. It is true that what happens in the n-dimensional policy space is important, but voters live in a value space that is largely created by elite rhetoric, by the political culture. So it doesn't have to be specifically that. And Roger gave the sort of de minimis. I think this is right. Having a candidate run ads is not the same thing, but the political culture is endogenous to the kind of political rhetoric that is being used and is accepted as this is what this election is about. Candidates are always saying, this is what this election is about. If I win that battle, then I am telling voters what to believe about the n-dimensional policy space. So that's the basic space that Peter Ordashuk was talking about. So if, as Professor Holcomb is suggesting here, and I think rightly, then voters are attracted to candidates or parties for complex reasons, and then they adopt or rationalize the policies that are embraced by those ideological choices. So more specifically, first, I think this book is a very good treatment of expressive voting, but the kind of expressive voting that I see all around me is maybe it's a little bit different than what it was that Roger was criticizing. So here at Duke, there is a kind of brigadoon. So instead of once every 100 years, a village shows up for 3 nights, once a year, a village shows up for 2 weeks. And it's called Sheshevskyville. And the poor kids live outside in tents, and it's really quite cold. And what they're doing is they want to be able to go inside a building, Cameron Indoor Stadium, and watch a basketball game between Duke and UNC. And what they want to do when they get inside that building is express their support for good against evil, the satanic UNC team. What they want to do is they want to stand up and say, yay, with one voice. They do not expect that saying yay influences the outcome, but they will pay great cost in order to express that solidarity with good against evil. That's a really basic human impulse. And so when you think of expressive voting as starting with those terms, there's a simple way that it actually does me a lot of good to be able to express my solidarity with what other people around me think is good. So economists have made elaborate and increasingly complex arguments about justifying voting as being rational. It can just be an expressive act. We live under the outcomes that are produced by the aggregate process, but there's no necessary connection. So, A, express solidarity with good and join with like-minded people in doing so. B, live with the outcomes that are produced by the aggregate process. There's no connection between A and B. What I do to vote has no impact on the set of rules that we end up living with that comes out of the aggregate process. So Tom Schaller and I had a piece on prohibition, and basically we proposed the same test that Randy did, looking at polls. Now, the polls aren't great, but looking at polls, a substantial number of people who voted for prohibition, if you had asked them on their way to the poll, we've decided to do this differently this year. We're not actually taking a vote. You personally get to decide whether there's going to be prohibition or not. They just said, oh, hell no. They assumed prohibition was not going to pass, and so they were going to go and make themselves feel good. And if they were men, make their spouses feel good by saying, I'm against demon rum. And she'll say, oh, good, you're the man I thought I married. So that paper was in Public Choice. I think Brexit, a lot of people, if you had asked, they didn't think Brexit was going to pass. They were free to vote for it, knowing as a protest. They're pissed off. Donald Trump You don't think you have to go back to Jesse Ventura. A fair number of the people who voted for Donald Trump in 2016 thought there was no way in hell he was going to win, but they thought Hillary Clinton was a bad candidate, and they were right. She was. She was just even worse than they expected. So that's all fine. So far, all I've talked about is the expressive part. Randy's contribution, the thing that makes this actually important, is that he then has an explanation for what happened after the election. A number of people who had voted for Trump actually seem to have changed their expressed views in the n-dimensional policy space. The claims about immigration, they became much more extreme on immigration. They became much more opposed to free trade. And, well, my friend Brink Lindsay, who some of you may know, who used to work for Cato, Brink Lindsay was a big anti-Trump guy. He actually has moved really far to the left after Trump was elected because he has adopted the positions of the anti-Trump people. If you look, there have actually been changes. So what I think is important here is not the explication of the expressive voting, which I just think is straightforwardly true, at the margin during changes, not overall, but at the margin during changes. The important thing here is to explain the changes that happen after maybe an unexpected event where people actually rearrange their policy preferences as a result. So what Holcomb is saying is something deeper. Many traditional Republicans and many working class Democrats actually became Trump supporters, changing their reported views. Because by 2017, if you look by 2020, they're responding to survey questions about their preferences that make it sound like they prefer Trump. But the direction of causation is the other way. Since they prefer Trump, they have adopted those rules. So I don't think that's used. This is sort of a Phillips curve relationship. It's not manipulable in equilibrium. But when there are changes, this is the way the changes cash out. Most of the time, if we spend money, it has no impact and people stick, and there's no distinction between these two directions of causation. So the direction of causation only matters when there's a change. But I think Randy is really onto something, and I was pleased to get a chance to read this book and comment on it. So thank you.
Thank you, Mike, very much. Randy, do you want to respond to the points raised?
Yeah, let me make some comments here, Chris. First of all, thank all the three of you for your comments. I really appreciate them. And I don't disagree with anything that any of you said. I did make some notes here. And so partly I'm responding to the comments, but here's something I thought as you were speaking. So first of all, Roger, the cover was my choice in the book. So yeah, I picked those sheep, and I think it's pretty descriptive. One thing, Roger, you mentioned was these Enlightenment ideas, which, I think Enlightenment ideas cut two ways. I mean, really, up until recently, people had the idea, there's a ruling class, those people make the rules, they tell people what they can and can't do, and everybody else is subjects of the government, and their obligation is to abide by the rules of the elite. And Enlightenment ideas were pretty influential. Rather than people being serving their governments should serve the people. And so that put a lot of constraint, just the adoption of those ideas put a lot of constraints on the ruling class, just that change in ideology. But it also had another effect in that if we accept that notion of democracy, and I think we see it really strongly in some Enlightenment writers, I guess one place especially strongly is in Rousseau's ideas of a social contract, that basically when democratic governments make decisions, that they're embodying the general will, the will of the people. And so those Enlightenment ideas, on the one hand, they're a challenge to the political elite. But on the other hand, this notion that democratic governments act in the interests of, they're accountable to the people, those Enlightenment ideas further legitimize democratic government. So why is it that George W. Bush was able to invade Iraq and Afghanistan? Well, it's because he was the president. People chose him, and it was his choice to do that, as opposed to some unilateral choice. No, that's the choice of the people, according to those Enlightenment ideas. So I think the Enlightenment ideas cut two ways. And Roger, you also made an interesting comment about expectations and how one of the things that the political elite influences expectations. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. I guess when you were saying that, I was thinking about FDR's administration during the Great Depression. So here the guy gets elected term after term after term, and he's telling people, we're going to do policies to pull the economy out of the Depression. The policies never worked. The economy never came out of the Depression. But nevertheless, he was able to sell these expectations. He was able to sell these good feelings. And Bobbi, asked the question, when do we change our expressive preferences? When might we change our expectations? And one interesting thing about government is, we have one government. We see what happened as a result of the political elite's choices, but what we don't see is what would have happened otherwise. And so, going back and thinking about the FDR example, so FDR comes in, he said, I've got all these solutions for the Depression, but the economy stays in the Depression. The solutions don't work. And so it's easier for a critic to say, well, look, what he did is counterproductive. It didn't work. The economy never came out of the Depression. But the FDR supporters say, yeah, but things would have been a lot worse if it hadn't been for his policies. And we don't know. It's a counterfactual. If you eat at a bad restaurant, you had a bad meal and you can choose another one. But if you're judging FDR's economic policies, we can see what happened, but we can't see what happened if some other policy had been enacted. And again, Bobbi was talking about expressing opposition. And I think, that's true. A lot of expressive voting is in opposition. And my own feeling, see how what other people think about this, but in the 2020 presidential election, my view is nobody voted for Biden. Some people voted for Trump, and other people voted against Trump, but very few people were Biden supporters. It was expressing support for Trump, expressing opposition to Trump. And Bobbi, you mentioned the Ross Perot, and I'll just say, to me, he seemed like a lot more credible candidate than Jesse Ventura. He actually seemed to have some ideas, and all. Jesse Ventura, a handsome guy and a good wrestler. I think a lot of Perot voters really did like Perot as their first choice. And I think, Bobbi, you were talking about the local level. And on the one hand, it seems to me these arguments still apply at the local level. I'm thinking about myself I'm in a local community, has under 200,000 residents, so a relatively small group, but I don't have any influence. I don't have any say on what goes on. My vote's not going to count in the election. So I don't know about that. But the one thing about local governments is there you do have a comparison. It's more like the restaurants. Okay, my government's not going too well, but look what's happening in the neighboring county. Look what's happening in the neighboring city. So you do have that intergovernmental competition, and there are options. Bobbi, you were thinking the whole thing sounds sort of hopeless up until the end of the book, and I don't know, maybe I guess I wasn't even thinking about that tone as I was writing the book, so. It might be hard to tell, but actually I'm an optimist. I think things are going to get better in the future. I'm optimistic, but I also think they're not going to automatically get better in the future. I think that our freedoms, that our rights, that our autonomy, that the productivity of our economy, those are things we have to actively work to protect. And I think myself as an academic, if part of my motivation is that's what I want to do. Those are the ideas I want to impart to my students. If I'm writing something, those are the kind of ideas that I want to impart to my readers, because I am optimistic, but at the same time, I see that those values that have enabled us to prosper so much since the Enlightenment, since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, they're under fire. They're going to continue to be under fire. And so I'm an optimist that we can protect them, but I also think they need continual protection. Yeah, I think, Mike made some comments about the policy space that we're looking at. And I think that there's a lot to what he said about the fact that the political institutions really collapse a multidimensional issue space into a single left-right dimension. So we have policy preferences, multidimensional policy preferences, but we really don't have multidimensional choices. And that's especially true in a winner-take-all type democracy like we have. I mean, you can pick A or you can pick B, but you can't pick any place in the policy space. And at the same time, I think that what people are choosing there is aspirations rather than policies. That candidates aren't selling policies; they're trying to sell aspirations. They want you to feel good about what they're talking about, and they don't necessarily want to give you any specifics or talk about. If I'm elected, here are the specific things I'll do. What they say is, if I'm elected, I'll make things better. And I have to say, let me just pass along an anecdote. This goes from way back when I was in college, and Hubert Humphrey, the first, not the one we already talked about. Hubert Humphrey was running for president. This would have been, I think, in the 72 election. He wasn't the party's nominee, and Hubert Humphrey, it's been long enough ago, people might not know. He was a senator from Minnesota. He was vice president under Lyndon Johnson. Running for president, I went to hear him speak. I was at the University of Florida as an undergraduate student at the time. I went to hear him speak in this big auditorium. He comes on stage. The crowd is booing him. There's all this record. I thought he wasn't going to be able to start talking, but he managed to quiet the crowd down. He said, hear what I say before you make up your mind. And if you don't like what I have to say, yes, you should boo me, but wait till you hear what I say before you make up your mind. He gave a brilliant speech, and it was all this feel-good stuff. And I remember I was an economics major, and I remember his prescription about the economy. So Humphrey is saying, the economy is like an 8-cylinder automobile that's only running on 6 cylinders. We've got to get those other 2 cylinders running again. Yeah, the crowd went wild. They loved it. This guy has such economic insight. Let's get those other 2 cylinders running again. But my point is, these political campaigns, they're feel-good messages. Vote for me. You'll feel good. They're not specific policy proposals. And finally, I will comment. Mike talked about the prohibition example, Brexit, and those are pretty interesting cases. And I think might deserve a little more scrutiny. But it's entirely possible those were expressive votes, and that if people had the choices to make on their own, those decisions might not have been made. So I think there's probably potentially good examples that help to illustrate the impact of expressive voting and people following their leaders. Again, thank you very much to the 3 of you for your comments. I really appreciate them all. Chris, I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about some of the ideas. So I'll close my comments there.
Well, thank you, Randy, and congratulations again on the book, and thanks to all the panelists for doing this. Randy, this book in conjunction, I think, with this series of books you've been writing, so the last 2, Coordination, Cooperation, and Control and Political Capitalism, together really, among other things, being they're valuable in themselves, but also I think show the vibrancy of the public choice research program and the wonderful set of ideas that are continually being developed, but also the real world applications to human well-being. And so thank you all very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to the Hayek Program podcast. To learn more about the research, scholars, and work of the Hayek Program, visit hayek.mercatus.org. For more information about graduate student fellowship opportunities for students at Mason as well as at universities across the globe, please visit students.mercatus.org. We hope you recommend students to our programs or consider applying yourself.